What's going on, everybody? This is John. I'm here with Charlie, and we're here for the Penn State Roundtable podcast. Guess we'll hop right into that Ohio State game, Charlie. Definitely a tough performance for Penn State. Um, and there's a couple of things I guess I just want to say quickly about the performance. I know you're down, a couple points, 3 points at halftime, and it almost feels like weirdly, hey, maybe this is like the one game Penn State can actually beat Ohio State, and feels like it hasn't happened in 15 decades at this point. But weirdly, maybe it just actually happens for once. You come out in the second half and you give up 21 points, and the offense just continues to look like what Penn State's offense always does against Ohio State. And I know this is a different year, but it was disappointing again nonetheless. So what were kind of your thoughts on the game?
Yeah, it's just very similar to how it's been in years past, kind of what you alluded to. It always just feels like there's something missing between when you're looking at a program like Ohio State and a program like Penn State, who, both in the Big Ten, both have a lot of money behind them and a lot of support, nationwide. And just for whatever reason, just Penn State just can't seem to find a way to get on even footing with some of these bigger schools in the Big Ten that they're, constantly competing with and trying to fight for a championship.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I guess I want to talk about was just the lack of, well, what's the right word? I guess the lack of hype around the game, so to say. You fired James Franklin in a decision that does make sense. To me, it made sense. And you entered the year as the number 2 team in the nation, or number 3, my apologies, but you were number 2 during the Oregon game. You had to assume come November 1st that this Ohio State-Penn State game was probably like a preview maybe of the Big Ten title game. And, as someone who went there, I know you said you have family who is at Penn State now. But it really does suck for the kids at the school who really just, there's probably no juice on campus right now over a game like that. And even for the Ohio State fans, not that, I love Ohio State fans, but There certainly it almost kind of didn't feel like a Penn State Ohio State game. Granted, a 20-point loss, 20-plus point loss isn't really going to feel like that all the time, but it was a bit unfortunate to see that. I hate that, honestly. I think that's something that as you look toward the future, you don't want to be on the Penn State side of that. You kind of hope that's how Ohio State feels, but kind of as you alluded to, Ohio State's been on the right side of history over a lot of this time. And, we'll kind of get into our second point right away here, because I think if you look at one thing for Ohio State and Penn State and the difference between the teams, and you can blame Franklin for not winning these big games. I get it. It's a fair argument at this point. The Duke cannot win the big games. But then you watch those big games, and even the Oregon game last year when they lost before, this overtime loss. You lose in the Big Ten title game to Oregon last year, and it was like you didn't have a wide receiver that Oregon did. And Oregon's guys are fast, they're physical. And even Ohio State with Jeremiah Smith this week, like just the size difference between Ohio State's wide receivers and the offense in general, like, I'm going to say here is just Ohio State's offense is up here, elite, and Penn State's is just, it's boring. And I know there's no Drew Aller, there's some injuries, but you still have Katron Allen, you have Nick Singleton, and it's just been, even with Aller under center, it was very, very underwhelming in a year that I think, from what I've read and heard from a lot of friends and fans of Penn State, that you thought this was the year where the offense was finally going to get figured out.
Yeah, I mean, like you have those 2 running backs who, by all accounts, are going to be NFL players. But like you mentioned, John, with the receiving core, it's just, even last year, it felt like outside of Tyler Warren, did they really have a receiver that Aller could go to, in a big moment? Not really. And did they do much to replace either Warren or bring in a true receiver like that this year? No, they didn't. You know what I mean? And Ohio State has, they have Tate, they have Jeremiah Smith, and it just kind of seems to me that that's really the differentiating factor there when it comes to the difference between these 2 teams, is just the lack of a true physical threat like that.
Yeah. I think, even interim head coach Terry Smith kind of said it best after the game. Like, you look at what Ohio State has done with, JSN and Olave and Wilson. It's like, there's just Marvin Harrison. Like, a lot of the top wide receivers in the NFL have gone to Ohio State. And unfortunately, it's continued to just be the thing to me that kind of bites Penn State in the behind. And then, you have Terry Smith come out after the game, and he said, like, straight up, him and, Carnell Tater, the two best players in the country, wide receiver wise. And he even went as far as to say that they're better than any Ohio State receivers that he's ever had a game plan for. Now, I don't know if I agree with that. Maybe Smith is, and I'm no disrespect to Tate, but I think Smith is probably like a guaranteed top 5 pick in 2 years, where Tate will probably be a first rounder, but maybe not that high. But it kind of begs a couple of questions. And one of them to me is like, is it a money thing? I mean, if you look at Penn State historically, it's linebacker you, and, you have some really good guys coming off the edge. Even the past few years, seen that with Chop Robinson, Micah, just guys like that. But how can you get that game-changing offensive guy that obviously you need in college football? Is it the quarterback's fault? Do we have those guys and they're not doing that? And is it because of the quarterback, or do you think it's simply just Ohio State has that recognition for being wide receiver you at this point? And if you're an elite wide receiver, why would you not go into an explosive offense type of thing?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, when you look at the two schools, and let's say you're a top receiver prospect coming out of high school, I mean, of course you're going to want to follow in the footsteps of guys like, Garrett Wilson and, Olave, even more recently Egbuka with the Buccaneers this year, who he was a late first round pick, and he's come in and been a legit NFL receiver from day one. So
that might be the best of the bunch like this year, outside of, Jackson Smith, but he's been really good too. So it's almost like, as you said, if you are a recruit, and I don't want to say your career goes and dies at Penn State if you're a receiver, because we've seen them with, Pat Freiermuth and Warren last year, like they can develop tight ends. But they hit a couple guys in the portal this year, and you're, especially Pena from Syracuse, you kind of thought like, well, this is going to be 1,000+ yard receiver with maybe 7-8 touchdowns. Like this dude could be a, pretty high draft pick. And I mean, he had 3 receptions for 11 yards against Ohio State. And granted, I get it with the quarterback situation, but it's really tough to really keep defending at some point. But I guess to kind of follow up on what I'm looking for now is like, is there any chance Penn State could hire Brian Hartline, like offensive coordinator of Ohio State? You look at, around college football, and I think there are a couple of obvious candidates who we'll get into here, in a couple minutes, but Hartline is maybe benefiting a lot from having NFL ready wide receivers, and, Julian saying too right now. I know he has the second shortest odds. He might even be the favorite to win the Heisman right now. But like the dude was just throwing, moon balls the other day, I guess you can say, and he's just dropping them in the bucket 60 yards down the field. And it's like, okay, is it the players that, they can recruit, or is Hartline really developing them? Is he really calling that much better plays, or is it a simple talent thing? So I like Hartline. I think he'd be a decent fit at Penn State. But I also kind of want to be cautious a little bit, because if you can't recruit the athletes and the players offensively that Ohio State can, how much, different does it look if he's your head coach without those guys? So it's definitely something to, consider. And I guess just to finish up on the Ohio State stuff, obviously whenever Penn State and Ohio State play, it's always, one of the biggest rivalries in the country, maybe outside of, them in Michigan, Ohio State and Michigan, but in the Big Ten, maybe just as big of a rivalry as any other, program. And I think Ryan Day kind of hit it on the head. After the game, he said, the halftime, even though they were still winning by 3 points, put a bad taste in everybody's mouth. And I bring that up because I think if you were Penn State a year ago and you were up 17-14 at Ohio State, or even at home, like the whole entire locker room would have been ecstatic just to be ahead. And it's like, well, Ohio State's a better program right now. There's no debate about it, but you're still Penn State, and, you have this long list of history. How do you get back to that where you're like, you're still beating maybe one of the better teams in the country talent-wise, but I'm upset because we're only up 3 points. And I'm kind of curious to hear like what you think maybe Penn State can do to get into that.
Yeah, well, it's got to start at the top with the head coach, and I'm sure that's something that Franklin was there a long time. So at the start of his tenure at the program, I'm sure throughout many parts, they did have that excitement and that enthusiasm for, hey, we're here on the road, we're taking it to the number one school in the country. Although I don't know how many times that actually happened under Franklin, but it's just it's got to be a level of demoralization, especially after losing Franklin like that. It's not like, hey, we're up here. It's more like, hey, we got to hang on to this or else. You know what I mean? It's more pressure and tension than it is excitement and exhilaration.
Yeah, and I think that's like 90. Again, we don't know what goes on inside the locker room at Penn State and what really happened with Franklin, I guess, and how the guys kind of just, I don't want to say quit, but once they lost to Oregon, to me, it felt like the guys on the roster kind of thought, hey, we need to come into this year and win national championship. But like along the way, you have to beat Oregon and Ohio State. And the second they lost to Oregon in such heartbreaking fashion at home in a whiteout, and maybe the biggest game in Penn State history outside of the semifinals last year in a really long time. And it just felt like they got so high for that when they lost, it was just like it killed every momentum, anything that the program was kind of building at that point. But I guess we can stick with James Franklin here for a little bit. Charlie, I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts about Franklin as a coach, what you think he can maybe bring to another program. I have my opinion, but would love to hear yours first.
Yeah, so for Franklin, I mean, I think it's fair to say that while he was, he struggled to win those big games, and he had some shortcomings in Penn State's biggest moments. I don't think you can really deny that he was a great recruiter, and he did bring in a lot of great talent to Penn State just by evidence of how many NFL players they've produced over the last 10 years or so of his tenure at Penn State. But going from a program like Auburn Penn State to a place like Auburn, like that's been rumored, I think that would be a great fit for him because not that Auburn's a small school compared to Penn State or anything, because they're relatively big spots in the Big Ten and the SEC. But I do feel like there would be less of a pressure to win those big games at Auburn, as opposed to having to go to Ohio State and beat them, having to beat Oregon at home. Auburn definitely has a bit easier time. But their biggest game is probably the Iron Bowl against Alabama every year. So it seems to me like a pretty solid fit.
Yeah, and I think the one thing, as you kind of look at Auburn after it fired you look at them right now, and they're 14th in the SEC. They're 1-5 in conference and 4-5 overall. But I always think of Auburn and like them returning that kick against Alabama on a field goal, and you think of guys like Cam Newton and stuff, and it's just they're not what they once were. And the one thing I'll give credit to Franklin, and I liked Franklin before this year. I definitely was in the boat of, I understand if you did fire him before it happened, I would understand why. But I always sided with, some caution there because, as we'll kind of talk next slide about, but there's no guarantee that you're going to bring in a coach who, I get this year was really bad, but for the most part, you're going to win 10 games every year and you're going to finish top 10 in the country. There's no guarantee that you're going to continue to be even a top 15 team at that point. But regarding maybe his Auburn stuff, I think one thing that would be important for them is Auburn's kind of in that spot like Penn State was after some of the sanctions and Bill O'Brien and all that, where you needed to really build the program back up to what it once was. And I think if there's one thing we have to give Franklin credit for is that he built Penn State back up to what Penn State used to be. And I know it didn't end a national title, but even if you look at his Vanderbilt days, like he took a pretty bad Vanderbilt program. I know they've played well this year and even last year. But for the most part, he had to build that program up too. So I think he's almost, as cheesy or as funny as it might sound, like, you play Madden, you want to redo a franchise or something like that, and you try to get draft picks. And I guess in this scenario, it would be recruits. He knows how to kind of sell, what he's trying to build. Granted, I do think if I'm Auburn, I probably am a tad worried about a lot of his lack of success in games that matter the most, just because if you look at Auburn's schedule, I mean, they played Alabama, ranked opponent. They played Oklahoma, or sorry, they haven't played Alabama yet this year. My apologies. But they played Oklahoma, they played Texas A&M, they play, Kentucky, Georgia, Missouri, and then they finish out the year with Alabama. Those are all games that if Franklin were at Penn State, you really have to question if he can win. Now, I know a lot of his lack of success was really against those top 5 teams, those really good Michigan teams, those Ohio State teams, but it wasn't exactly like his record against top 25 teams in general was anything to write home about. But I do think eventually Franklin will find the right job for himself. I think, his resume speaks for itself. I understand why Penn State fans might be a bit upset with how, the ending went and everything. But as a whole, I think if you really look back at Penn State's history right now and what Franklin did, you have to kind of be appreciative of, him turning it around. And I don't want that to get lost in sight. So I do think he'll do just fine, at a place like Auburn. I've also seen, there could be some other openings around college football coming up. I know Florida's, an opening now, but after following Billy Napier. Virginia Tech is an opening, which I've seen him linked to a few times. I even see some fake, tweets going out that he's signing a deal there. So it seems like some Virginia Tech fans want him. It'll be interesting to see if Mike Norvell gets fired at Florida State. But it seems like right now Franklin should be in a pretty good spot to get the job he wants. And dare I say, as sad as it might be for some Penn State fans to hear this, but is there any possibility, do you think, that wherever he ends up could even end up being better than Penn State?
Well, I mean, he'll definitely have. I think there is something to be said about the pressure of a Penn State head coach, just because they haven't won a national championship in so long, and the history, like you said, of that storied program. I just think going anywhere else, especially going to the SEC, while you still you're playing against some of the best competition in college football, I do just think there's a little bit less of a spotlight on him and the inability to win those big games. So. Yeah, I think Franklin's next stop, wherever he goes, and he'll probably have his pick because, I mean, you look at the landscape of college head coach candidates, I mean, he's definitely going to be at the short list at the top of the best available ones. So, I think you could say you got confidence in wherever he lands next in his next stop.
Yeah, I'm curious really to see with him. My big thing is I know Lane Kiffin's been thrown out there a lot. Obviously, he's with Ole Miss right now, who is pretty good. But, if he can get that Florida LSU job, maybe he takes it because he could view it as a step up. But I think there's a possibility Franklin could get one of those two jobs. And the one thing I'm kind of looking out for at that point would be, well, if Franklin was a guy who can bring in a top 15 recruiting class at Penn State in the Northeast, what can he do if he has Florida, Louisiana, the Carolinas, and, maybe even dabble into Texas a little bit down there? It'll be real interesting to kind of see, I think, there. But I guess for Penn State fans, we're probably tired of talking about James Franklin at this point. It's kind of over with. And we'll hear, probably we've already heard hundreds of names thrown up at this head coaching opening. But one guy in particular, and he's a Jersey guy kind of close to you and I in South Brunswick, or he's from there, is Mike Elko. Now, Elko was at Duke 2022 and 2023 seasons, was actually replaced by former Penn State coach Manny Diaz. But is at Texas A&M now. And history-wise, again, you think Texas A&M, maybe guys our age, you think of Johnny Manziel, you think of Mike Evans, like you think of, 12th man really being a popping college football atmosphere. And there's a lot on their side. Apparently, again, I know NIL numbers aren't out there in the public. But people say Texas A&M has all the money it can possibly have to spend. Apparently, they have some oil money down there. It's just that serious. You know how Texas football gets. So I'm a bit skeptical that Elko is even a possibility, but everybody keeps saying he is. And I don't know if it's because he'd want to come back to, the Northeast. But I kind of question a little bit why he'd want to take the Penn State job if Texas A&M does have all the resources that it does.
Yeah, I mean, he does seem to have a pretty good gig there down in Texas. But I mean, the resume definitely speaks for itself. He's spent a lot of time, not even just at Duke. This is his second stint at Texas A&M. He was the DC there from 18 to 21. Yeah. And it does seem like he's kind of got a tab on the whole recruiting situation. I mean, just this Texas A&M team this year, they're leading two receivers, Mario Craver and Casey Conception, both transfers. Conception from NCSU and Mario Craver from Mississippi State. But if he can bring that with him up to Penn State and kind of continue that what James Franklin started of being a top recruiter in the area, it seems like he could be a pretty good fit for that Penn State team and what they're trying to continue to build is they try to get back into that national conversation of prominence.
Yeah, and I think Elko is kind of the perfect example for what I'm going to say is you look at him and you see a lot of Northeast ties, right? He started his career at UPenn as a player in 95, and he goes to Stony Brook as a graduate assistant, goes to Penn as a DB coach, Fordham right here in New York, Hofstra in New York as well. And then he kind of makes his way down in the Carolinas and everything, goes to Wake Forest, Notre Dame is in Indiana, but then ends up, at Texas A&M, then back at Duke, then back at Texas A&M. But my one thing I will say about him is if you even take away the NIL money and the figures that can kind of be thrown out there for Texas A&M, if they do have that much more, is really just kind of the simple fact that, hey, my job as a college football coach nowadays is to kind of ensure that we have the top recruits in areas and stuff like that. And, I spoke about it with a couple of friends of mine at Penn State, and it's like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, there might be a total of 10 to 15 blue chip prospects if you're lucky every year. And I'm talking like 4 to 5 star guys. That's kind of, your range. But if you go to Texas, there's probably 30 in each class. And that's without factoring in like maybe getting a couple of guys from California or a couple of guys from Arizona. It's just like Texas football is that much better. And it's really no disrespect to especially New Jersey, because New Jersey high school football is really good. But Texas is kind of a different beast. So I'm curious if that'll play any factor. Again, I know I've said it a lot, but I do think a lot of it, and it's really just a simple fact of like money. If you go up to Elko and I'm just going to throw out a random number. If you say here's 10 years and $100 million, whatever it is, like something outrageous, the dude's probably going to take the job. If you go in there and trying to just take him for a little more than what he makes at Texas A&M, you start factoring in tax differences in Texas and Pennsylvania, and it probably doesn't make much sense for him to take the job. Now, the one thing that I think can be on Penn State's side, if we take away recruiting, is obviously the history. So you think about Penn State, you probably put them higher than Texas A&M by a pretty considerable amount when just thinking about college football. But Penn State will really have to hope, I think, in this cycle that, that type of recognition from coaches is on its side, because, with Florida and LSU especially, like those are two major universities and major programs with a lot of resources and much easier recruiting. So I guess a bit different than Elko in that regard, but, who's to say he wouldn't want to take the Florida job if he was offered that? So I guess obviously something to consider here, but at the moment, I wouldn't say Penn State is going to be hiring its next head coach for at least another month or so. So we'll have to continue to kind of deal with them playing, with this current roster with Terry Smith, and they'll take on Indiana this weekend. Now, speaking of history, when you think of Indiana, the first thing you always think of is basketball, obviously. You don't really think much about Indiana Hoosiers when it comes to football, but I'm not sure if I really still even think about them too much, but you can't really deny anymore what they're doing as the number 2 team in the country. I mean, they went into Oregon, beat a top 10 ranked Oregon team at the time. Outside of that, the competition has been very, not going to lie. But right now, Penn State hasn't really shown me anything to suggest that they can come away with this win. So I'm curious what you think. Yeah, no,
I mean, just like you said, John, I mean, Indiana's playing like one of the top teams in the country, regardless of who they played and who they haven't played. They can only beat who's in front of them. And it's safe to say they've been doing that. Yeah. Mendoza has been, just lights out. He might be the first overall pick in the draft this April in the NFL. And they got a lot of talent. And Penn State, they were unable to contend with the likes of Oregon at that whiteout game a few weeks ago. They took them to the edge, but it just kind of seems to me that they're going to be outmatched here in terms of talent and probably in terms of coaching as well.
Yeah. Now, the one thing I do want to give Indiana credit for is you kind of hit on, like, you can only play who's in front of you at the end of the day. I mean, the Big Ten is still very good. Perhaps not the SEC in terms of, a whole. But outside of that, I think it's pretty comfortably the second best conference in the country. But you kind of look at what they've done, right? And really outside of that Iowa game against, at Iowa, against a decent team, they won 20-15. And obviously, the Oregon game, nobody really expected them to kill them, but they won by 10 points. I know it was close for a lot of it, so maybe the 10 points seems like a lot, but that's a really good win. But you look at kind of, some of the other games, and they beat Illinois 63-10. They beat Maryland 55-10. And they beat UCLA, a UCLA team that beat Penn State, and they beat them 56-6. So all that to kind of say of, like, Indiana's not really messing around right now. And you look at the rest of their schedule, and, they play Penn State at home. So I'm going to go on a limb here and say that I know Penn State has been bad, but that's still a tougher game to me than Wisconsin at home and Purdue on the road. You have to almost feel like if you're Indiana right now, if you win this game, you're kind of guaranteed to be in the Big Ten title game, bearing something drastic happening in one of those last two games and losing them. But if you lose it, maybe it becomes a bit more questionable because you don't know what happens in those last two games. But nonetheless, I do think this is a Penn State team that will have to really come out and almost play even harder than they did against Ohio State, because it looks like Indiana will run it up on you and really have no hard feelings in doing so.
Yeah, I guess it could turn out to be a good measuring stick for like you said, that Big Ten championship of likely going to be Indiana and Ohio State. See how Penn State handles both of those guys. It's going to compare for both of those teams, but yeah, I mean, like you said, Penn State's got to have a real good game plan. They got to be ready to play, and they got to hope those running backs are ready to go.
Yeah, and I guess I'll end on just one more thought here for myself is that even when I spoke about Ohio State a little bit last week with some friends, it's like I get Penn State hasn't played well in terms of record this year. And I would have, I know you can't go back and say this, but I really want to know what would have been different had they beat Oregon, because I just can't see a scenario where they won that game and then lose to UCLA, Northwestern back to back. I think the entire season is different at that point, like I said, in our first segment here. But the reality is that this was still a top 5 team in the country coming in, and everybody kind of thought like, hey, this is Penn State's best chance to win a national title in a long time. So there's still talent there. And I'm curious at some point if that talent ever realizes how good it might be. And I don't want to say they could beat Indiana because they haven't given us any thoughts about them doing that. But as weird as it might sound, if Penn State were to win Saturday, I don't think I'd be as maybe surprised as others. But I'm kind of curious to hear what you think on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they definitely still do have the talent there that made them a top 3 team in the country before the start of the season. I mean, of course, you lost the quarterback, but everything else is still there. So, it wouldn't be like one of the all-time major shocking upsets, but it would be something special for sure.
Yeah. I guess we'll be talking about it next Wednesday, same time around. And we'll find out if Penn State, hopefully, as I keep saying, you got to go out there and compete. Don't get embarrassed. If you do that, to me, that's worst of a sign, because it almost looks like you quit on the team. But we'll see you guys next week. Hopefully it'll be a better weekend for Penn State fans than it has been, but I guess only time will tell. But this is John and Charlie, and I appreciate you guys listening to the Penn State Roundtable podcast. Thanks.